here last week, I handed out 2 packets of material. One of them is titled The Bread of Life, and one of them is titled The Gates of Hades. That's going to be the substance of where we will be next week. What I'm going to try to, I think I said last week that we would deal with that 2 weeks from last week. So what I'm going to try to focus on next Sunday is the role of geography in the teaching of Jesus. There's a very direct correlation between where Jesus was standing or sitting and what was coming out of his mouth. Jesus often, not always, often used his physical surroundings to make the point. And there are 2 illustrations of that that are fairly vivid in those 2 handouts that I gave to you. For those of you going on the trip, you'll see, I'm sorry?
A little bit louder.
A little bit louder? You want me to be louder? Which way? That's my problem. Okay. She wants me to be louder, guys, so we can handle it. I hope. So 2 of the illustrations that I think vividly enable us to see this principle are reflected in what Jesus does when he is at the foot of Mount Hermon at a biblical site called Caesarea Philippi, which is where he says to the disciples, "Whom do men say that I am? Whom do you say that I am?" And remember, in response to that, in Matthew chapter 16, Peter makes what is called the so-called Great Confession. And remember Jesus' response to that. "And I say that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it." It will be very important where Jesus was standing when he makes that kind of a statement. On the other hand, at another place and at another time, Jesus says to a crowd in a synagogue, "I am the bread of life." It's not coincidental that he made that. We're going to deal with other illustrations. There's going to be another place and another time where Jesus says, "I am the water of life." He doesn't say, "I'm the water of life," when he says, "I'm the bread of life." One might have thought he would have said that. After all, something to eat, something to drink, it goes together. But Jesus says that's not his way of teaching, because when he was in Capernaum, he was where bread was made, not where water was made. And when he was at the woman at the well, he's at where water was made, not where bread was made. And there's going to be another time when Jesus says to his disciples, this is also in Matthew if you want to read about it this week. If you want to look it up, I can't, frankly, I don't have the citation here in front of me right now. Jesus was on his way to, well, the Matthew says they were on the road, he and the disciples were on the road to Bethphage, B-E-T-H-P-H-A-G-E. And that's where Jesus says to his disciples, "Do you have faith like a mustard seed? I tell you, if you have faith like a mustard seed, you can say to that mountain, be moved, and it will move." And lo and behold, where they are on that road, the Roman road, not the modern road, as you're crossing over the Mount of Olives, with your naked eye, you can look south and you can see a place that Herod the Great built for himself, a palace. And in building the palace, there were 2 juxtaposed mountains. And Herod simply took the top of one of the mountains and moved it to the top of another mountain. And on the top of that second mountain is where he built his fortress. "I say to you, if you have great..." And he said, you could say to this mountain, be moved, and you could be moved into the depths of the sea. At that same place, you can look a little bit more to the left, and lo and behold, it's one of the few places in the land of Israel, away from the Dead Sea, where you can stand there, and you can see this mountain that Herod built, and you can see the water on the surface of the Dead Sea. All a part of what Jesus was teaching when he was located where he was located. That's where we're going next week. But today, and 2 weeks from today, I am going to deal with 5 texts from outside of the Bible that, in my opinion, are among the five, I guess I hesitate saying the most important five texts, but five of the most important texts from outside of the Bible that pertain to this or that story in the Bible, and what those texts have to tell us about the biblical storyline and the historicity of our Bible, the credibility of our Bible. Anyhow, that's where we'll be choosing to stick. You'll notice from that, does everyone have the handouts now? There should be a grand total of 5 pages. I'm sorry, so kind of. How many have 5 pages? Okay, what I'd suggest is that the people on this side of the room have been more brisk in passing, and the people on this side of the room who have 5 pages are over here. This is the elect.
Wait,
All right, so let's go ahead and pass these. Where are the sheets that are being passed? Are there some here coming? You guys over here?
Green is the second sheet that takes it over there.
Okay, this is the red page. This is the green page.
we have the red page.
Page 1.
Page 2. Page 2 and the green page.
Okay, so I have what you don't need. It's around here someplace. I'm looking, yeah, there you go. That's what I'm looking for right there. There must be a supply of those that haven't gotten to this side of the room yet. Green one? There were
That one over there?
Well,
Things we so complicate. Maybe when we walk in next time, we should take her home.
I mean, we didn't get everything. I know we made the same amount.
Yeah. We found them. They got
Oh,
us.
you got them?
Just remember, this will be on the test.
Start this around too. Start this around.
That's in the front of the Trinity.
You know what, there are enough of these. There must be some people in here who do not have this.
And he's got 2 pages. I only just 2 Bible verses.
All right, let's go ahead and,
Who's waiting for that?
I've got extra pages up here, so if it turns out that you don't have them all, you should be able to get them after this. Okay. You'll see that I've gone to the trouble of printing one page in color that is basically the theme of much of the first half of this course. I think it's important that we see that God prepared the promised land for his chosen people with the same degree of care that he prepared the chosen people for his promised land. If you think about it for a minute, what is printed in blue is saying that God has been at work in history. God has been at work in time. That part of the story, that is the blue-colored part of the story, is almost a no-brainer. We know that's the case. When Abraham first came to the land, God said, the time hasn't yet come for you and your descendants to be here. And there's famine in the land, and he went through to Egypt, and eventually he came back, and eventually his children and his grandchildren and his great-grandchildren were able to live there long enough, but then there came another famine. Of course, then we know that they moved to Egypt, and they were enslaved in Egypt, and they were there for a while. Eventually they got liberated, and they went to Mount Sinai, and at Mount Sinai they were given a national law. They became nationally confederated. They were given all kinds of laws, and they were there. In other words, there was an evolution. The people were not ready to assume prominence in the land at the time that Abraham first went there. So we have the story of how God prepared the people for the land in our Bibles. Yes?
Yes.
That's a no-brainer. We have that in our Bibles. That's saying that God has been at work in history. God has been at work in time. What is colored in brownish color is saying that God has also been at work in space. God has also been at work in geography. And I would argue that you can read between the lines of the biblical text and infer with no less clarity that same thing. I'm going to read one text, if I can get my glasses. I'm going to read this text right out of Deuteronomy today. And we'll come to this text in a bit. But this is one of the texts that illustrate the fact that God was at work in space and not just in time. I'm reading from Deuteronomy chapter 11. It is a text, Deuteronomy chapter 11 is the last chapter in the first 11 chapters. I realize that sounds odd to you, but chapters 1 through 11 is a block of material. When you start chapter 12, then chapters 12 to 26, that's a different block with dealing with different kind of subject matter. So in effect, chapter 11 is the very, so to speak, the crescendo, the climax of what Moses is trying to be teaching the Israelites. And you will recall, by this point, Moses knew full well that he was not going to be permitted to cross over the Jordan River and enter into the land because of what had happened earlier in his life. And so he's giving instructions, he's giving warnings to these people in terms of what life is going to be like when they cross over the Jordan River and enter into Canaan. Now, listen to the contrast. I'm reading verses 8 through 17. That's just 2 paragraphs. The Lord, Moses is saying, the Lord is saying, "You shall therefore keep all the commandments which I command you this day, that you may be strong, and that you may go in and take possession of the land which you are going over to possess, and that you may live long in the land which the Lord swore to your fathers to give to them and to their descendants, a land flowing with milk and honey. For the land which you are entering to take possession of is not like the land of Egypt, from which you have come, where you sowed your seed and watered it with your feet, like a garden of vegetables. But the land which you are going over to possess is a land of hills and valleys, which drinks water by the rain from heaven, a land which the Lord your God cares for. The eyes of the Lord your God are always on it, from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. However," excuse me, that was going to be my addition that I intended to put in, but I put it in too soon. So forget about that. Now comes the contrast. The Lord says, "And if you will obey my commandments, which I command you this day, to love the Lord your God and to serve him with all of your heart and with all of your soul, he will give the rain for you, for your land in its season, the early rain and the latter rain, that you may gather in your grain and your wine and your oil. And he will give grass in your fields for your cattle, and you shall eat and be full. However, take heed lest your hearts be deceived, and you turn aside and serve other gods and worship them, and the anger of the Lord be kindled against you, and he shut up the heavens, so that there will be no rain. Then the land will yield no fruit, and you perish quickly off the good land which the Lord your God gives to you." May I just ask that we would go to the Lord for a second before we get into this more fully. I ask, Father, that you would give to each one of us insight and understanding as you open our minds and give us instruction from this, your holy word. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. God has prepared the promised land for his chosen people with the same degree of care that he prepared his chosen people for the promised land. In my atlas, I said something that I can't say it better, and I can't say this without reading it, so I'm going to. That illustrates this. I said much of the biblical storyline's character and aromatic quality reflect the specific geographic realities at the place of its birth and enactment. Thus, for example, the land of God's covenantal promises might have been created with the aroma of an environment without blemish. It might have been permeated with the flavor of ecological or climatological perfection. It might have been endowed with the taste of a tropical rainforest through which coursed an effusion of crystal clear waters. It might have been brought into existence with the texture and brightness of a thickly carpeted grassy meadow, or the scent of an elegant garden suffused with the pungent fragrance of blossoms, mosses, and flowers. It might have been, but it was not. As I will attempt to, well, as I say here, God prepared, the land of promise that God prepared as the stage on which his storyline would be enacted is a locale that embodied the direst of geographic and environmental hardship. Innately possessing meager physical and economic resources, and positioned where it was caught inescapably in a maelstrom of relentless political upheaval, this land has yielded up to its residents a simple, tenuous, mystifying, and precarious existence throughout the biblical period, even under the best of circumstances. It is an important and helpful insight to recognize that God prepared a certain kind of land, situated at a particular location, fashioned to elicit a specific and appropriate response. Now, last week I described the land as being a land that was essentially suited for the shepherd as over against the farmer. I might have talked today about the fact that it is a strategically located land, or I might have talked about the fact that it is a small land. I've chosen instead to talk about the fact that it is a destitute land. And God has been prepared in space, just like God has been preparing time. In fact, it's interesting to me to consider the fact that in the book of the Revelation, chapter 21, there are explicit statements that tell us that in due course there will be no more sea, no more death, no more dying, no more pain, no more crying, no more hunger, no more thirst, no more night, no more time. At no point does it say, but no more space. Quite to the contrary, if you think about it, it's that same chapter that talks about a new heaven and a new earth, a new Jerusalem that, note the verb, is coming down. Even the verb has a spatial connotation. In other words, it's not totally off the wall that when one is talking about spatial realities in the Bible, one could be talking about eternal verities. That may be overstretching it a bit, but at least we know that time will be no more, but we know that that will not be true of space. Anyhow, I said here, God prepared a destitute land. I want to focus on its destituteness. Notice I've said in my outline, the land has virtually no precious metals. People don't go there for diamonds. People don't go there for ore. I said small quantities of low-grade copper, not enough to create an industry. There's some magnesium, there's small quantities of iron, limited gas and down south, and so forth. Almost no petroleum resources, and that might strike a person as being odd, since we're talking about the Middle East. And the Middle East is pregnant with oil. I can tell you that modern oil companies have given up on Israel over 20 years ago. I know people who are hydrologists who used to work for oil companies, but who are also Jewish, and so they wanted to seek to find oil in Israel, and they worked for Sunoco or some big companies, and they went there 30, 40 years ago, right after 1948, right after the state was created. For about 20 years they looked for oil, and then those guys now, the ones that I know, are tour directors or computer hackers or something like that, because the oil companies have pulled out long ago. Over 20 years ago, all of the oil companies have pulled out, and the reason is because I'm sure there are some people here who know this far better than I, oil is a function of geology. You've got to have the roots in order to get the stuff, and they don't have the roots. That's the way God created it, I would argue. So virtually every drop of oil that is consumed in Israel is imported, not like it is here, where I guess more than half of the oil we consume is is national. Not so there. Twice in my 38 years at Trinity, I've had the same experience. A student or some students meet me on the sidewalk and say, Dr. Beitzel, have you heard? I just heard it on Christian radio. They found oil in Israel. That happened to me about 20 years ago. And then it happened about 8 years ago. Remember, in this case, it was 2 or 3 quite excited students because they had heard, I suppose the story grew as they were running towards me. Not only had they discovered oil in Israel, but it was going to be the largest cache of oil in the whole Middle East. And my response to them was this, the same as I have given in class ever since. If you hear on radio that oil has been discovered in Israel, and if in fact you actually see the black stuff flowing, I can tell you what has happened. The Israelis have dug down 6 feet, and then they have bored and they've hit that oil line that comes out of Iraq. It simply ain't there. It's a function of geology, and this may be significant because of what I said here, a venture seeking to discover oil as a means of fulfilling prophecy. You see that line? If you see that line, I made a typo. It should be chapter 33, not chapter 32. It's chapter 33, verse 24. In that chapter, this is again Moses towards the end of his life, and when you read the chapter, you'll see that Moses singles out each of the 12 tribes and gives to them a poetic kind of blessing. And as it turns out, the 12th of the 12 sons is Asher. And that verse says, may Asher dip his heel in oil. Now, there is a I'm pretty sure, a well-meaning oil person, tycoon maybe a little bit too much, from the United States, who now for about 20 years has been drilling for petroleum in Israel. I see you nodding. You're familiar with this. I have an article clipped out of the Wall Street Journal, which indicates that this man was induced to try to find oil in Israel because he was convinced that the discovery of oil in Israel would probably prompt World War III, and that would hasten the return of the Lord. Far more importantly, if this article is to be trusted, this well-meaning Christian man had collected, this article said, between $10 and $11 million of American evangelical money because people were keen on trying to bring prophecy to a fulfillment. Now, first of all, let me show you Asher. You've got to be a little imaginative, artsy, I suppose is the word, to even see a foot. But this is a layout of the 12 tribes, and way up here, you see this yellow area? All right, this man sees in that yellow area a foot, and this is the heel, and presumably this is the toes. I'm just sharing the view. I'm not necessarily seeing. That's the heel, that's the foot. This is Asher. The yellow area is the territory that was allotted to the tribe of Asher.
What page is that in your book?
It's
Sorry.
page 123.
Okay.
It's map 40.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, now, so the man has been drilled, and as a matter of fact, those of you who are going along to Israel, it's entirely conceivable that we will drive right by this guy's rig. Because when you go to Mount Carmel, it's on the north side of Mount Carmel where he's doing his drilling. I think his funds have dried up, no pun intended. And so the rig is a little bit dilapidated, but I know the last time I checked was 10 or so years ago. They had bored 2,500 feet down.
Wow.
And all they had found was exactly what any geologist would tell you was there in the first place: gravel and sediment. it doesn't have the geology. Now, here's the thing. Here's the thing, guys. The word translated oil in that verse is olive oil. There is no Hebrew word in the Old Testament that accurately translated petroleum. And there is no Greek word in the New Testament that can be accurately translated petroleum. You'll notice I've given you the citations there. It does say that there was pitch or tar that was put, that Noah used in the ark, and then there was pitch or tar that was used in the basket that they made to put Moses, in the bulrushes and so forth. In the first place, the second of those citations, maybe I should back up for a second. Neither of those citations was geographically located in the land of promise. One of them was located, presumably, close to Mount Ararat, and the other was located, presumably, very near the Nile River. But even if that's to the side, the word simply doesn't mean petroleum. It means, and I've given you all kinds of examples. The word translated oil in that verse actually is used about 150 times in the Old Testament, and you see it's used for light. There are places where it is specifically paired with olives. In other words, it says olive oil, or it's used with trees. Olive trees, where it's used as perfume. I don't think anyone would want to put, Ruth didn't put petroleum on when she's going down there. And the wife, the bride in the Song of Songs is said to have been doused in the same word, but she's not putting petroleum on. I would assume she was not. It's used in medicine. Isaiah has a wonderful passage where, I've given you the citation there, where he talks about oil being applied to wounds. The same thing is used in Luke. The Good Samaritan, we're told that he applied oil to the wounds and wrapped them in caring for. It's used in medicine. And as I say, it's used for anointing, often used with the word holy. In other words, when priests use this in the Holy of Holies, it's not just oil, it's modified by the adjective holy. It's holy oil. So I guess what I'm saying to you is, it is a land that is destitute of petroleum resources. If you're tempted to sit down and write a check to try to fulfill prophecy, my advice to you is to do three things. Write out the check, take 3 deep breaths, and address it to Village Church of Gurnee. You talk about getting a bang for your buck compared to, and the irony is, if we drive by this rig, there will be there will be olive trees all over the place. Olive trees all over the landscape. So I guess what I'm saying is Moses got it right. Asher can dip his heel in olive oil. Okay, thirdly, I guess, about timber. Another natural resource in which God has made the land of promise destitute, and I would say deliberately has made it destitute. This is not accidental. This is not willy-nilly. This is part of God's great handiwork. We'll come to the reason for it in a bit. Notice I say the Bible makes repeated references to wood of what we would call today wood of the vintage variety. So the Bible is filled with references to olive trees, fig trees, sycamore trees, myrtle, balsam, acacia, almond, pomegranate, date palm, and a few others. But you're not going to get a good 2x4 out of any of those trees. They can't be used for architectural purposes. They are not hardwood. They're vintage wood. But notice also I say, the Bible actually makes scant reference to hardwoods required for architectural purposes, for example, oaks, cedars, cypresses, or pine. And furthermore, note, many of those biblical citations that identify cedar forests or cypress forests locate those forests outside the land of promise. And thus, if you go to the second page, when David needs wood, hardwood, to build his palace, notice what the Bible tells us. He has to go up to Lebanon and deal with the king of Lebanon, whose name was Hiram, and do a deal with him so that David would send up oil, and olive oil, and other things like that, in payment for which there could be trees in the forests of the cedars of Lebanon and brought to Jerusalem. Notice Solomon has to do the same thing. When Solomon wants to build the temple, once again, he needs wood. He's not going to find it inside the land of promise. Not in the kind and capacity that would be needed for major architectural undertakings. The same thing. You can read 2 Kings. Notice this verse in Ezra chapter 3 is very interesting to me. We remember the story, do we not, when the Israelites had been living in Babylonian captivity for 70 years. And remember, Jeremiah said that you will live there for 70 years and then you'll be freed. Remember, a Persian comes to Babylon, his name was Cyrus, and Cyrus frees all the slaves, including the Jewish slaves. And he permits dispossessed peoples to return to their homeland, including the Jews to return to Israel. Yes? Read what else he does specifically for the Jews returning to the land. He does two things extra to them, for them, I should say, according to Ezra chapter 3, verse 7. He brings, number one, he brings out various vessels and, what would you call them, utensils that had been used in the temple. But the Babylonians confiscated that stuff when they destroyed the temple. And since they're going back to build their temple, he brings out some tools, some utensils, some vessels. You understand what I mean? So if they're going to rebuild the temple and they're going to have service, religious services, all right, now they've got some vessels. They don't have to go. That's the first thing he does. And Ezra chapter 3, verse 7 tells us the second thing he does. He gives to them a sum of money with which they could purchase wood. Because someone had put a bug in his ear. Those guys are going to a place where there ain't no good wood. And he actually does that. And not only that, you can read in Nehemiah chapter 2. We know what Nehemiah's task was. Nehemiah was the cup builder for this guy in Persia, and he became so impelled to go back and help his countrymen. Yes? Remember that story. And he's not going back to Jerusalem, to build the temple. He's going back there to build the walls and to build the gates of the walls and so forth. But the story is the same. Nehemiah, that was not Nehemiah's first trip. He had already been there. Furthermore, he knows that if he's going to be building city walls and city gates, he's going to need wood. Notice Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 8. Before he leaves, Nehemiah goes to the king, Artaxerxes, and gets a letter authorizing him to gain access to wood. Another illustration of that. And of course, Herod the Great was building all over the place. Big, monumental, mammoth stuff. And some actual wood that was used by Herod the Great is still, some of you guys will be able to see some actual wood that has been in place for 2,000 years. But chemists, of course, can test the wood as to its origin. And the wood that has been tested, brought there by Herod the Great, came either from Greece or from Italy. Not locally.
Wow.
It is a land that is destitute of hardwood. And fourthly, and where I'd like to spend a lot of time today, is it is a land that is destitute of water, fresh water. If I were to begin this section by saying to you, how many freshwater rivers of any size whatsoever, of moderate size, do you think flow through the entire land of Canaan? What would your answer be? One? Okay, somebody says one. Any more takers on one? You're one too high. The answer is 0. It's true that the Jordan River skirts the side of the land of promise, but it is also true that the Jordan River, south of the Sea of Galilee, cannot be used and was never used as a source of fresh drinking water for two reasons. You understand that the Jordan River between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea is the lowest, it is the only river on earth that flows from one end to the other below sea level. The lowest body of water on earth is the Dead Sea. The second lowest body of water on earth is the Sea of Galilee. One is 1,300 feet, well now almost 1,400 feet because the level of the water keeps going down, and the other is about 750 feet. And the water's down in the gully. And until you got electric pumps to be able to pump water up hundreds of feet, which as far as we know, they didn't have in the biblical period, and even if they did,
I saw this show on aliens.
I'm sorry?
Daily.
Yeah.
Well, even if they had pumps, they didn't have electrical cords quite long enough. In other words, the water couldn't be used. And moreover, there's even a more profound reason why the river, why the water of the lower Jordan cannot be used. It's anywhere from 15 to 30% salt. Not only is the Dead Sea the lowest body of water on earth, it's also the most saline. Anywhere from 25 to 33. It's twice the salinity of Great Salt Lake and 10 times the salinity of ocean water. And by the time the lower Jordan gets to the Dead Sea, that's how saline the water is. So there are good reasons why the Jordan River was never a source of water. We need to understand that there is a completely 180-degree difference the way we in the States understand water and the way people in the Middle East understand water. In this little book, I said, we here have a negative connotation when we think of water. The way to ask yourself, do you think negatively or positively about precipitation, is this way. If you're gonna go on a date down to some Millennium Park, are you gonna pray for sun or rain? If you're gonna have a Sunday school picnic next Sunday, which of course we wouldn't, would you pray? And notice how we even do this in our music. I'm quoting now some, I believe, American music. Rainy days and Mondays get me down. Raindrops keep falling on my head. Don't rain on my parade. Rainy days are into every life a little rain must fall. Rain, rain, go away. Come again another day. Stormy weather as over against beautiful skies. Or warm and sunny forecasts as over against dismal forecasts. Just listen to meteorologists for the next 2 weeks and see them illustrate what we're saying. It's raining in my heart. I had an illustration of this just this week. Actually, about 10 days ago, I was in communication with my land vendor in Israel in conjunction with this trip. And I said to him at the end of my email, it's minus 5 degrees outside, and we've had almost 50 inches of snow. I'm quoting his response that came just this week.
Wow.
He said, we've had one good-sized storm in early December, but not much of any precipitation since, and nothing in the forecast. A very disappointing winter for us on this side. One of the reasons why precipitation is supposed to be viewed positively in the Bible comes out of that text that I read to you today, but we'll see it in other texts in the red and green sheets that I distributed, but don't look at them quite yet if you don't mind, is that as a sign of God's benevolent blessing, He's going to send the rain. And Matthew says, He's so good, in the Beatitudes, God is so good, He's going to send the rain upon both the just and the unjust. That's good. We might think, Is God that mean, that he's going to rain on everybody? No, no, no. God is that good. This is the Beatitudes are having to do with God's benevolence, God's love. And notice that text also said, and if you do not obey me, I will withhold the rain. We're going to see that there's a direct correlation, a function of faith. Fertility is a function of faith. It's all over the place in the Old Testament, and it can be illustrated in many different ways. I've talked here about Baal, the god, the pagan Canaanite god Baal. The most commonly used, identified pagan deity that we have in the Old Testament, 75 times, or a few more maybe. But notice, not a single one, the Bible never once references Baal until after the Israelites cross over the Jordan River and go into the land. And the reason is because Baal was the chief god of the Canaanite pantheon. And Baal was a fertility god. The reason why Baal was the chief god in the Canaanite pantheon before the Israelites got there is because what those people really need is precipitation. They need rain. In antiquity, people create gods to get them over humps. That's an oversimplification, but it's a true oversimplification. And the hump here is, we've got to have adequate rainfall. And so we'll create a god that gives us rain. He's a fertility god. You never have fertility gods. You never have fertility religion in Egypt or in Mesopotamia. The reason is because you got all kinds of fresh water. And in fact, it rarely does rain in Cairo. And not very often in Baghdad. But you never have fertility god. The chief god in the Mesopotamian pantheon is a solar god. It's a sun god. The chief god in the Egyptian pantheon is a sun god. Because the hump those guys needed to get over, they had plenty of water, but they needed to make sure that their plants could receive, we would say today, sufficient photosynthesis. So they create sun gods because they don't have a crisis of water. In Israel, they have an abundance of sun, but not a lot of water. And so they created, and so oftentimes people say to me, Barry, that generation of people that crossed over the Jordan River, I mean, think who those guys were. Those people had experienced as much of the element of divine miracle, of supernatural event, as any generation before them, and probably any generation in the Old Testament. Maybe Elijah, but and of course the generation of Jesus, of course they experienced. So how could a generation of people so personally familiar with God's presence in the form of dynamic miracle, how could people who had experienced that kind of miracle, after all, they just saw the miracle of the Jordan River drying up and they walk over, how could those people get to the other side and all of a sudden they're worshiping Baal? Very simple reason. A very simple reason. Because when they get from that side of the river to this side of the river, in other words, when they left the Jordanian side of the river, where you've got all kinds of fresh water, rivers, they might have only traveled 20 miles and went to the west side of the river. But as soon as they get to the west side of the Jordan River, they're in a completely different environment. A completely different environment where the land was and still is to this day rainfall dependent. You don't get enough rain in a year, the first year you have drought. You have 2 years of drought, you have famine. I've said in my notes there are about 10 famines recorded for us in the Bible, including one in the book of Acts. Just read those famines. I've given you the text. And notice what the people do in the land of Canaan when famine comes. Abraham comes, first thing he does is hightail it to Egypt. Later in the book of Genesis, it was the famine, the 7 years of famine. And what happens with Jacob? The 70 go to Egypt. And later, there's a famine in the time of Elijah. He goes across the river to the Jordan. And you'll see that that's pretty much the pattern. In the book of Acts, when there is that famine, notice that Luke records for us that the church in Antioch, up in Syria, gave a donation for the church in Jerusalem because they wouldn't have experienced famine. They've got all kinds of fresh water. So just north of Israel is Lebanon, all kinds of fresh water. Just east of Israel is Jordan, all kinds of fresh water. Just southwest of Israel is Egypt, all kinds of fresh water. In fact, do you realize this? And this is hard to believe. I almost don't believe it myself. But I keep saying it because I know it's true. The Nile River disgorges into the Mediterranean Sea every day half as much water as is consumed by all of the citizens in the state of Israel every half year. 6 months of fresh water, day in, day out. If there would ever be an opportunity for a peace treaty, you know, that would be a wonderful peace treaty. Yeah.
It is interesting because I'm in the water business, and so they're proposing this enormous project in Israel where they'll have to make a pact with 2 other countries, adjoining countries, so that they can get some water.
Yeah. Right.
Which country?
And it's very controversial. I don't
yeah.
recall.
Okay.
at
Well,
the moment.
one would be Egypt and one is Jordan. Actually, they're thinking of building a canal from the Red Sea to the Dead Sea, and because it's so deep, creating the effect of a waterfalls, and so they could create it would be a major source of hydroelectricity, and they could use less oil and less coal in creating electricity. The other one is up in the north. In fact, in 1964, when the Arab League was formed, it was formed in the year 1964. And one of the, I forget who, somebody, one of the Arab leaders, suggested that they might divert the waters of the upper Jordan by creating a canal instead of the upper Jordan going south through the edge of Israel. They would divert it and it would go east and run into the Mediterranean Sea. And I still remember Moshe Dayan's statement, "It may be water to you, but it's blood to us. So don't start with water, what's going to end in blood." Probably 40% of the water supply is in the Sea of Galilee. I mean, that's a national reservoir. Those of you going to Israel, when you get to Jerusalem and you turn on your shower or you turn on your water faucet, you know what I mean? That water's being piped to you from the Sea of Galilee. It's a national reservoir. That's the reason why that water's dammed up on the south side of the Sea of Galilee, because once the water gets out of the Sea of Galilee, it's gone in terms of human consumption. Just an example of modern comparisons. I'm comparing the water supply of the United States versus, per citizen, the prorated per citizen of Israel versus modern Israel. In the United States, the numbers that I have from I forget the U.S. agency, it works if you think that there are about 300 million people in the United States, and I think that's pretty accurate. Is that pretty accurate?
Yes.
Okay, that's the figure I used. That means that each one of us would have available to us approximately 2.6 million gallons of water, fresh water, to drink and play in every year. That's our figure. In Israel, and at this point I'm using 6 million because that's a slightly inflated figure that includes both the Arab population and the Israeli population, every citizen has, on average, 85,000 gallons annually. So whereas you and I have just over 7,100 gallons every day, an ordinary Israeli or Arab living in Israel has just over 200 gallons available to him every day. It's no wonder that they see water as a prize, not as a bother. And that's the way God created this land. And now go to the blue and the red sheets that I gave to you. Here's where I'd like to spend a little bit of time. I'm trying to illustrate this reality. What did I say? Yeah, green.
Green.
That was a color. And it wasn't red. Okay. Okay. Now, the idea is that the green sheet should precede the blue sheet, the green sheet should precede the red sheet. And the reason is because you'll notice that the first three texts have the good news first and then the not so good news later. And notice my heading on this. We have a Christian chorus that we sing today, which should be, the title should be spelled differently, and any Israeli could sing it. Our God reigns, R-A-I-N, not R-E-I-G-N. Take a look, first of all, at the Leviticus 26 text. And if you look in the book of Leviticus chapter 26, you'll see that this is information that Moses is sharing with the Israelites while they are still at Mount Sinai. They're at the foot of Mount Sinai, and this is among his concluding initial remarks, and it's the first place where he starts to introduce this land that is flowing with milk and honey. Notice first the good news. If you walk in my ways and observe my commandments, notice obedience is a function of fertility. I'm not describing us. Don't hear me to be saying that. God didn't create the United States the same way he created that land. He created that land for a purpose, and probably has created this land for a different purpose. So I'm talking about that purpose, okay? So if you walk in my ways and if you observe my commandments, notice, then I will give your rains in their season, and the land shall yield its increase, and your threshing shall last to the time of vintage, and the vintage shall last to the time of sowing. I mean, they thresh barley and wheat in the months of March and April, maybe May, and they're going to be in this image. This is just an image, you understand, but he's saying your threshing shall last to the time of vintage. In other words, you'll harvest your grain from March, April, and May, the whole way till August. That means abundance. And then he says, and your vintage will last to the time of showing. So now they're getting grapes in August that there's so many grapes they will harvest them way until December or January. You see that? It's abundant. I mean, see what I mean? It's like if you're an American farmer and you have alfalfa so that you can make hay for animals. It's like saying you could harvest your alfalfa from June to December. You could get 20 cuts of alfalfa. I mean, like any American farmer that I know of would take that deal at any time. That's a bargain. But notice how Moses links fertility and obedience. Now, the contrast in the same chapter. Notice just later in the same chapter. Now go to the red sheet. But if you will not obey me and will not do these commandments, if you spurn my statutes and break my covenant, I will do this to you. I will appoint over you terror, wasting disease, fever that blinds your eyes and causes your life to pine away, and you will sow your seed in vain. I will break the pride of your power, and I will make your heavens like iron and your earth like brass. As a sign of God's judgment, he withholds the rain. As a sign of God's benevolence, he graciously gives the rain in its season. Notice the same thing in the Deuteronomy text. I read that to you this morning, so I won't reread. You'll notice in Deuteronomy 28 is the same thing. These are among the final words out of Moses' mouth before he dies. Notice on the green sheet, the Lord will open to you his good treasury, that is, the heavens, to give the rain in your land in its season, and to bless all the work of your hands, and blah, blah, blah. You see that. But look over at the red sheet. Then the Lord will smite you with wasting disease, and with fever, and inflammation, and fiery heat, and with drought, and with blasting, and with mildew. They shall pursue you until you perish, and the heavens over your head shall become brass, and the earth under you shall become like iron. The Lord will make the rain of your hand like powder and dust, and so forth. You see how the image of God's judgment is being reflected, both metaphorically and literally. And you see that in texts throughout the canon, including in the New Testament. There are about 24 times in Scripture where, as a sign of God's anger because of Israel's sin, God says, all right, I'm going to withhold the rain. And he does. And there are 3 occasions when God apparently gets so grieved at the sin of the people that someone comes along and says, in the name of the Lord, I'm going to withhold, God says, I'm going to withhold the rain and the dew, D-E-W. That was true in Elijah, so let's use the Elijah text. Remember in chapter 18 of 1 Kings. It's not on your, no, I don't think it's on your sheet. No, it's not on your sheet, I didn't put it there. I mean, if, do you guys, any of you guys familiar with a farm? Or you ever lived on a farm, or you had, okay, you put your hands up, okay. Any of you who have lived on a farm, just give me your honest answer. Do any farmers you know figure they're going to have crop failure or crop survival based on the presence or absence of dew? I mean, my grandfather farmed his whole life, and that's, well, he's not the only farmer I know, but I mean, he would have chuckled, probably quite a belly chuckle, if I would have said, oh, there's no dew, Grandpa. He'd say, what? Do what? But see, that's us in the West. No, I suspect no farmer here in the States, and most places in the world where you have lots of precipitation, they don't even care about the dew. In Israel, today, they count dew days, D-E-W-D-A-Y-S, and they record them. And I've always debated that. I said to those guys, why do you guys call them dew days? You should call them dew nights. There are some places in modern Israel that receive more precipitation via nighttime dew than they do out of the skies. And they measure, there are some places where there is as much as 200, 225 nights of dew. And they are measured because they are vital. It's not surprising that modern Israel has jumped to the head of the class in terms of cloud seeding technology and drip irrigation and the like. None of this.
Yeah.
No. Drip, drip, and so forth. That's simply modern reality. What I'm trying to get us to see is the biblical reality that is only an anterior illustration of the same sort of thing. It's the way in which God has specially crafted this land for his people. If God had made for his people a paradise, it wouldn't have required faith to go there or to live there. He prepared for them a place that requires faith. A land that requires work. A land which, under the best of circumstances, means you might be able to eke out the barest of existence. It is a greenhouse for growing faith. That's what it is. Am I supposed to stop now? I forget what time I'm supposed to stop.
Noon.
12 o'clock?
12.
Okay. Okay, good. Then I'll go with this illustration. Okay, now, think with me for a moment. I'm changing the subject only a little, but I'll come back to the same subject in a bit. Way back in chapter 12 of Genesis, God said to Abraham, get up from the land that I showed and go to a place where I will show you, and I will make of you a great name, and by you will all families of the earth be blessed, and so forth and so on. You remember the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis chapter 12? There were 2 components. God promised Abraham essentially 2 things. He promised him a land And he promised, I'm sorry?
Heritage.
And seed, yes, what do you call it, would you call it?
Heritage?
Heritage, yeah. In other words, he was gonna have children, a seed, a biological seed, okay, you're with me. Now, where does Abraham ever get land, as far as the record of the Bible is concerned? Abraham spends the rest of his life in and out through the land that was promised to him, and never gets anything except for 3 burial plots. And he purchases 2 of those. No land at all. But towards the end, there was famine in this land, and Jacob and the 70 hightail it to Egypt. Yes? You're with me? Early Exodus? Okay, now they're in Egypt. All right. How long was that famine? How many years of plenty were there? 7. 7 years of plenty, followed by X years of famine. How many? 7. Okay, 7 and 7. So they go down there. We don't know exactly when they go down, but probably they go down sometime during the 7 years of plenty. Okay? And so they're there for, let's say, the remaining 2, 3, 4 years of plenty. And then they're there. This is how God providentially provides for them to survive while there's 7 years of famine in the land. But of course, there's not famine in Egypt. Yes? They got plenty of water. Okay. So here's my question. When you open your Bible to the book of Exodus, chapter 1, you find that there are still Israelites living in Egypt as free people. It's not until later in chapter 1 that the Pharaoh decides he wants to make work crews out of them. Yeah? They're living there as free people. In fact, towards the end of the book of Genesis, Genesis actually records 2 trips that people made back to the land of Canaan to bury people. So they could go and come. They choose to come. Bible scholars with good reason, Old Testament scholars with good reason, will tell you that there's probably about 100 years' time that you should put into your computer when you're reading through your Bible, about 100 years' time between the end of the book of Genesis and the beginning of the book of Exodus. So people who went to Egypt to avert a 7-year tragedy are still living in Egypt 100 years later. Why? What? It's a whole lot easier. It's especially easier when you have your own land. Remember what the Pharaoh did for those people? He gave them the land of Goshen. I mean, not only did he give them their own place, lo and behold, when they go and search it out, they realize, hey, this is in the right section of town. This is on the wrong side of tracks. And I would argue it got pretty convenient and comfortable for them. Because in Egypt, they don't have to dig wells. They don't have to hew cisterns. They don't have to be rainfall dependent. Life in Egypt is much easier, much more predictable. The life of a farmer is much easier than the life of a shepherd. With all due respect, I'm talking about antiquity now. Cows have to be milked twice a day, I understand that. But there is more stability if you're a farmer. You live at one place year round. You have your own house. You're not going to be your life and survival is not going to be weather dependent. Shepherds are having to move from field to field, from season to season. Like soldiers, you know, in fact, this is actually literally true. In modern times, one of the reasons why shepherds in Mesopotamia have more than one wife is because they don't have more than one wife. Sometimes they do have more than one wife moving with them. A lot of times they don't. They're moving from wife to wife throughout the year as they're moving their flocks and their herds. So they're moving upstream, they're moving downstream, and they have wives along the way that they live with. I mean, that's just the way. The point is, life is far less stable. Life is
We're not sitting in the front anymore.
You mean you want to migrate? My question is, which one of you wants to migrate? So here you have a company of Israelites, so it seems, who were able to get a place to build a house and call their own land. Life was much more convenient for them in a land that was right beside the place that God had selected for them. And so they stayed put. Now, they get to the place where God says, you want to stay put? Okay, I'll let you stay put. You'll have quotas of bricks and so forth. Now they want to get out of there. When life gets difficult, oh, yeah, God, get us out of here. They raise their cry. There's no cry raised while they're free men. And apparently there's no smell in their nostrils of leaving the security of an essentially agricultural domain for the vulnerability of an essentially pastoral domain. It's part of the way God prepared the land for the people, and we need to see that and read our Bibles accordingly. I've got 8 minutes left. I'm actually pretty proud of myself. 8 minutes left over.
We are proud of you.
Good. So now, you want to chat? I've been gabbing almost this whole time. So, yeah.
Yeah, I've often wondered why the Egyptians turned against the Israelis
Why
and
the Egyptians
enslaved
did-
them. What was the, was there a key
Oh, they're
event
work
that occurred?
projects. They're work projects. Yeah, we don't know exactly who the Pharaoh was, but we have a pretty good guess. Still debatable. But we have Egyptian texts from the reign of what, in my opinion, is the most probable Pharaoh who enslaved the Israelites. And those Egyptian texts are quota texts of making bricks on a daily basis. They're
Building the pyramids.
They're actual. Well, they used it for all kinds of things. They didn't use it. No, they used stone in the pyramids. They were not using bricks in much later. Bricks, but different kinds of bricks were used in the so-called Middle Kingdom. Not the pyramids that you think of. Those are all
Stone.
limestone and granite. But they built houses. They built stables. In fact, this particular Pharaoh that I'm talking about built stables, just like, it talks about the stables. Hundreds and hundreds of these things are known. You can go, if you go to Egypt and you go to the right place, you can see these things. Walls this thick that are just made out of bricks. But the point that I'm making is now, there's at least one text and probably two that come from the same Pharaoh. And they're quota texts. They're actually written and out in the column, they're actual numbers that indicate that this supervisor was responsible for X number of bricks. This one was responsible for Y number and so forth. They're brick quota texts. So they need them for construction. Yeah. At a particular period in time.
Well, I'm confused, so maybe you can point me to what I'm thinking of. I thought that it was said somewhere that the Israelites were enslaved because they were becoming so numerous.
Yeah,
That the
that's right.
Pharaoh was afraid
Yeah.
that they might.
Yes, that is correct. No, that's Exodus chapter 1. That's Exodus chapter 1. That's correct. He's doing that because he's got an enemy. His enemy comes from Asia. Well, they're called Hyksos, and the Hyksos is the Egyptian word for Asian. But by Asian, the Egyptians probably meant Palestinians, people from Palestine. So the Egyptians see their enemy as coming from Palestine, and they realize that these Hebrews came from Palestine, so they see in the Hebrews a potential ally of their enemy, and so the Pharaoh acts preemptively.
Okay.
He doesn't give them a chance to join his enemy. But once he's got them, he says, you know what, I can use those guys. Yeah,
I'm just wondering if there was a correlation also at that time with the Israelites or the Hebrews breaking faith with God as being part of the reason why they lost their freedom.
that would be a little bit reading between the lines, I believe, but it's not totally out of the question. In other words, I'm trying to think, where could I go in early Exodus to confirm what you're saying? I'm not exactly sure where to go. That is, before they're made slaves. The trouble is, we only have a few snippets. We have about 6 or 7 verses of scripture. That's all we've got. So, maybe so, but I think you have to say, well, maybe I'm reading between the lines. Yeah.
So what's the whole thing of this land flowing with milk and honey kind of?
Were you here last Sunday?
No.
Okay, so I'm going to sit down. People who were here that's where we were last Sunday.
Okay, well, I'll ask Phil,
Goats
he'll
and
know.
bees. Yeah.
Goats and bees.
Yep.
Goats and bees.
That's it. It's,
Essentially, that you're headed in the right direction. Yeah,
Milk and honey was literally milk and honey.
yeah, yeah, not like,
Not metaphorical as we.
not metaphorical the way we use it today.
So is it
Yeah.
too early to ask for why pastoral? Or is that next week?
Last week.
No, it's not next week, so I suppose the answer has to be, no, it's not too early to ask. I mean, I'm not quite sure how to answer that question. There are not too many alternatives, maybe. Agriculture is one alternative,
Yeah,
but technology is not around.
yeah.
High-rise urbanism is not around, so the land is created in a way that's good for goats
Yes,
and sheep,
that's right.
flocks and herds, and that's why we have so much imagery that are reflected. There's a sense in my mind in which all those passages that I cited last week that talked about shepherds and sheep and so forth, those are simply illustrations of where we're going to be next week in the life of Jesus, where he's using his environment to teach this or that. Yeah.
When I was a young girl, I lived on a farm as well, and my father raised Angus. And then when all the help kind of left, he got rid of the Angus cattle and turned to sheep. And the big thing that he used to say as a farmer, he used to say, I can't get over that sheep don't drink water. Sheep take their water from the dew. So today, when Barry was talking about the dew days, it reminded me of my father's revelation when he was a farmer and was now raising sheep, that the sheep simply ate the morning grass and that was the water that they got for the day. And I'm kind of thinking about that being the pastoral land where the sheep go, where they also get their water from the dew, and that's...
The only time I have ever seen sheep, in the Middle East, the only time I have ever seen sheep not leave the side of the shepherd is when they come over a little grade and there's a river. Yeah, I remember at the Euphrates, and they come over the grade, and all of a sudden you hear the bells, you know, noise. You know there's a lot of action. You look up there, and the sheep are making a beeline because they see water. Yeah. Okay, well, 2 minutes. Who wants to put in their 2 minutes?
Depends on what clock you look at.
Oh, is it? Okay. All right, now, so next week, if you want to kind of be with me, spend 10 minutes and read those 2 little things. Talk about the bread of life, talk about the gates of Hades, and we'll talk about some other things. That's where we'll be next week. Okay? Bless you.